Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Derek Thomas. I'm the Senior Fiscal Policy Analyst at FPWA. Joining me is our fiscal policy team, Gaurav Gupta-Kasali. He's the Fiscal Policy Analyst, and Belen Ipola. She is our Fiscal Policy Intern. We'll also be joined by Diana Rodriquez. She's the Director of Government Relations at Eastside Settlement House. So together, we're going to provide a quick update on the status of COVID-19 stimulus and budget negotiations. And despite the uncertainty that remains this year in 2020, we at FPWA are optimistic about 2021. Our federal policy initiative is more than 2 years old now. Next year, we hope to build on those past successes to more effectively advocate on behalf of our nonprofit human service providing members, to strengthen the federal programs and social safety net funding that many of you rely on. We'll also go into a little bit more detail on what to expect next year, and hear directly from Diana on her experience partnering with FPWA's federal policy initiative. And then we do have one ask for you to continue sharing stories from your community. It's what makes this work unique. It's the research and analysis that's centered around the human impact. And positive stories are what moves people. And on our end, we find those stories very heartwarming, and it's a reminder of why we do this work. So today we hope to clear up any questions on those requests for stories and demonstrate the practical use of them. And then we'll wrap pretty early, so we'll have time for Q&A. So first, let's kick it off I'm going to pass it along to Belen, who is going to share brand new data from the US Census Bureau that's been tracking hardship. Belen?
So hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. My name is Belen. I'm a fiscal policy intern at FPWA, and I've been focusing on analyzing the household pulse survey data to measure the harm that COVID and our national policy response has had on households throughout the New York City metro area. So as we all know, the COVID pandemic has exacerbated the already existing hardships related to housing, food insecurity, education, health, and more. This situation is critical for many households, and that is the reason that we believe it's very important to advocate for continued and significant relief measures that will reach those in more vulnerable conditions. I'm going to share our analysis of the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey that's been tracking this hardship since April. The questionnaire is quite extensive, so we focused just on a few questions related to employment income, food insecurity, household expenses, and rent payments. So we'll be sharing more in the coming months, including adding more data from the survey and also tracking the trends. Well, to start with, as we all know, unemployment rates have risen sharply over the last months. And the survey has a question regarding the loss of employment income since the beginning of the pandemic. As we can see in these charts, almost half of New York City metro area households have lost employment income since March. Also, 30% of households are expecting to lose income in the following month. These terrible figures translate into households not being able to pay for food, for their usual household expenses, or their rent or mortgage payments. So as we can see in these charts, 23% of households in the New York City metro area are having difficulties paying their rent or mortgage payments. 10% are food insecure, and 36% are having trouble paying their usual household expenses that also include food, rent, but also medical bills or their student loans, for instance. So these figures highlight the magnitude of the COVID crisis and the importance of promoting policies that help those suffering these hardships. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and I'll pass it over to Derek.
Thank you, Belen. It didn't have to be this way. It's been 8 months since the passage of the CARES Act, even as the pandemic has raged across the nation. And today's unemployment figures, which aren't included, in that household pulse survey, are just as bad, with new claims being the worst they've been in weeks, with a total of nearly 20 million people on unemployment during the holiday season. And many of the measures, as you know, included in the CARES Act are set to expire at the end of December: paid sick leave, unemployment insurance, student loan borrowers, renters. State and local governments' budgets are getting worse because of the second wave. This is leaving millions in the city alone uncertain about their economic security. We at FPWA, our member organizations and coalition partners, we've advocated extensively for a comprehensive package. That amount, such as the HEROES Act, that was $3.1 trillion that passed the House back in May. That amount, unfortunately, isn't on the table, but there's hope that a bipartisan agreement on a $900 billion package, which has had strong support for a couple of weeks now, will pass and act as a bridge until Congress resumes in January. The measures included in the $900 billion package, the way they will keep that cost down is to have some of those measures expire in March and April. What exactly is included is sort of wait and see. Congressional leaders were meeting late last night, and it doesn't look like there's going to be a vote until Friday at the very least, or very earliest, and most likely over the weekend. Right now, it includes a second round of direct payments and unemployment benefits. All those amounts are pared down to $600 and $300 respectively. And it would leave out state and local funding and the liability shield, which is the most contentious parts of the negotiations. Meanwhile, the state is facing a $15 billion budget gap, and because of the second wave, is likely to worsen. That will translate into cuts to public sector workers and to social safety net programs. It could be that they pass a state and local relief package separately, but that seems unlikely in the Senate without the liability shield. They also includes $45 billion for transportation, $16 billion for vaccine distribution, and $325 billion for small businesses. That's being negotiated right now. Senator Schumer wants to put some more money towards idle venues, but a lot of this money also needs to go to restaurants that are shuttered. Ultimately, it's just not a package that meets the needs of the moment, and not enacting more stimulus now will slow the recovery and exacerbate racial inequality, in large part due to the impact of historic and current systemic racism. As we know, and we will be sharing in our data that Bailyn presented soon, the differences by income and race and ethnicity. So stay tuned for that. As if that weren't enough, Congress is once again flirting with a government shutdown. When we launched the tracker 2 years ago, that was just after the longest shutdown in US history. Funding runs out on Friday. It looks like they're going to pass another short-term stopgap bill, a continuing resolution that will extend, so far that it looks like, until Sunday. They have reached a broad agreement on a $1.4 trillion package for the funding bill. They're just working out the kinks. The snag, as you may have heard, is how to pay for veterans' health care, which and by complying with the budget caps. We haven't seen the details of these talks, but our latest analysis sort of showed the way that the House appropriations bill would increase human services funding to New York City very marginally, but included in that are some significant increases to weatherization assistance, emergency funding, and increases to LIHEAP, CSBG, and CDBG. So before we get into, we preview 2021 and what to expect, we're going to look back on our first year in our first inaugural budget season by hearing from Diana Rodriquez. Diana?
Hi, everybody. As Derek shared, my name is Diana Rodriquez. I'm the Director of Government Relations at Eastside House Settlement. And I was lucky enough to join the team in Washington, D.C. last year. Through this effort, it was such a great experience as an organization to really be able to share our stories, boots on the ground, of how the federal dollars impact communities. And we were able to connect with so many congressional members that really felt moved at hearing, not only from us, but from the different entities that also joined us, because we were able to partner to discuss housing and fiscal policies with the teams that we met there. For an organization as Eastside House, we were also able to look deeply into what our federal funds were and how we wanted to diversify it and actually increase it over time. Over there in DC, I was able to connect with the 3 congressional members that actually cover our districts. Eastside House is in the South Bronx and also in Northern Manhattan. And there we were able to share, how the Head Start dollars impact, our families going back to work and going back to school, and how we're able to provide those wraparound services, bringing nutritious meals to the seniors, and also just how all of this comes together to be able to improve the self-sufficiency levels of our communities as well. It was a great time because we were joined by such great partners in the work. And as a result, we were able to follow up with our congressional members afterwards. We actually took 25 students in middle school back to Washington, D.C. And based on our connections that we made there, they were able to tour the Capitol building and meet with some of the congressional members, including Congress member Adriano Esperlat. And that impacted them to know that, their congressional member also thinks of them. We were also able to connect with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office and discuss the first HEROES Act and, that stimulus bill and what kind of impact that could have on a community like ours. Overall, what we learned is that it was so important to share these stories because it made it real to everyone that interacted and met with the team there. Being able to advocate for, SNAP funding, being able to share the federal funds tracker and how that impacts us as an organization to be able to go back. And since then, we've increased our federal funds by 5%. To be able to show the impacts of how, rent subsidies are very much needed in our communities, especially as they're gentrified and they need more support on the levels of homelessness that exist there. So overall, it was something that I would love to do again. We were just talking about how impactful it was just to have everyone together and how we can get that same feeling during these times. And we'll go back to that so that way we're able to make those connections physically and also virtually so they could see all the great work that everyone's doing across New York City. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diana. Yeah, we were talking about, as we were looking at some of the photos from our DC trip, how nice it was to be together, and we hope to do so again soon. And we're so glad that you found the experience to be beneficial, and we would love to continue working with you. And we want to engage so many more of you in 2021. We want to first acknowledge that we approached this initiative with the understanding that, even before the pandemic, you all are busy supporting your communities. We also know that some of you don't, that most of your funding comes from the city and state, and there's a lot of work to do to secure that funding. So out of necessity, federal advocacy, may be less of a priority for some than others. So our goal here today is also to sort of illustrate, excuse me, the ways in which we've designed the tracker and our initiative with that in mind. We deeply respect the work y'all are doing and want to lift up and amplify the stories of your community and offer opportunities for direct action that require relatively minimal effort and resources. So as we, before we discuss that, let's hear from Gaurav, our fiscal policy analyst, on the city's sort of overall federal funding picture.
Thank you, Derek. 1 second while I'll just bring up this slide. Great. So we all know that New York City is, let me just put on my video. All right. So we all know that New York City is the financial capital of the world, has a population of about 8.3 million, which is nearly as large as New Jersey, and is home to many diverse and multicultural communities where over 640 different languages are spoken. But what sort of impact does that have on its budget? Well, in comparison with other state budgets, New York State's budget is the largest in the country, second only to California. Coming close behind is New York City's budget, which at $92 billion is larger than 46 other states. Drilling down further, we see that federal funding is $7.5 billion for New York City federal grants. That by itself is greater than 5 other states' entire budgets. Now, of that $7.5 billion, which is nearly 10% of New York City's budget, in FY19, New York City relied on $3.6 billion of social services federal funding, which is the component of federal funding we focus on with the federal funds tracker. Now, once again, to emphasize how large that is, let me just go to the next slide. Sorry. Yep, to emphasize how large that is, social service federal funding is nearly as large as Delaware's entire state budget. So nearly a quarter of all FPWA member organizations rely on at least $750,000 of federal funding every year. In FY19, 37 member organizations with an average of $5.7 million relied on over $210 million of federal grants to support social services programming. Unfortunately, in part due to austerity, federal funding to support these services in New York City has fallen by more than $300 million. The 2011 Budget Control Act set caps on defense and non-defense discretionary funding through 2021 and further reduced funding over time through across-the-board spending cuts known as sequestration. Furthermore, according to a recent report by State Comptroller Di Napoli, New York paid $26.6 billion more in taxes to the federal government in federal fiscal year 2018 than it got back in federal spending, ranking it last among the states. What that means is that for every dollar that New York generates in tax receipts, it receives merely 90 cents back in federal spending, compared to the national average of $1.21. Therefore, even though New York and New York City's budget is significantly large compared to the rest of the US, it is critical that we all continue to advocate for federal funding to fund social services so communities can receive the support that they need, especially now in the wake of the pandemic. Now, I'll give it back to you, Derek.
Thanks so much, Gaurav. And the point about slashing services since 2010 is salient, and that as advocates, we'll all need to work together, both locally and national, and to ensure there's a comprehensive stimulus bill in the first couple of months of the new administration, and that programs that have long been underfunded, even before the pandemic, are meaningfully strengthened in the federal budget so that they meet the needs of your communities. So now let's take a look at the website that powers this goal, FPWA's Federal Funds Tracker. Some of you are already familiar with the tracker. So we'll simultaneously preview this is the current site, and we'll preview the new site that we plan to launch next year. We will host an in-depth training after we launch the new site. But today, we just want to highlight a few features and resources that showcase how we're trying to accomplish our goal of centering our work around yours. So looking at the current site versus the new site, you'll notice a couple immediate differences. One is that we added 4 new human services agencies to capture all human services funding in New York City. Secondly, this version, and just as importantly, puts our research and analysis front and center. That's important because the research drives the advocacy. So let's visit one of our first publications that runs through, it demonstrates sort of running through the entire federal budget process. Shortly after we launched the tracker, we analyzed President Trump's fiscal year 2020 budget, both on the city's, both on the impact to the city's overall human services budget and on several members' budgets. But we also generated media coverage to amplify our human services center perspective, including some hyper-local coverage of the human impact of the Carter Burden Network. But then in the summer, we compared the president's budget request to the proposals included in the House Appropriations bills. So now, guided by this research, we kicked off our advocacy season. And before I get into those details, we should just mention that we at FPWA work within a larger coalition of umbrella organizations and policy experts. The umbrella organizations alone represent more than 500 faith-based and human services organizations and collectively serve more than 3 million New York City residents each year. We think this is important because the coalition believes, and we believe that, a coalition representing that many folks on the ground, that many service providers, and offering that many services across the city could be a more powerful force. So going back to sort of the advocacy season, following the release of our analysis of the 2 different budgets, we sent a letter to the city's congressional delegation. We asked them to stand firm behind the House proposal as the Senate began their budget deliberations. And to continue to amplify the message, Chris Hanway and the folks at Jacob A. Resettlement generally shared their space with us to host a rally with Congresswoman Maloney to continue to sort of raise the issues. Finally, and as Diane mentioned, we concluded our advocacy season with our first inaugural visit to Capitol Hill. We were joined by Diana, as well as the Chinese American Planning Council, as well as the Fiscal Policy Institute and the New York Housing Conference. We met with 11 members of Congress and key staff, and during these meetings, we presented the research, and then we handed it off to the members to talk about the local impact in their communities. So that's the through line between sort of the research and the advocacy. And we can expect the same this year, although maybe some Zoom meetings in the beginning of the year. And none of this would be possible without you. You all have taken collectively several hundred actions, whether it be signing letters, visiting DC with us, joining press conferences, Zoom calls with members of Congress during the pandemic, and so on. Equally important, many of you have taken the time to share your stories from your community about the ways in which these grants meaningfully improve people's lives. So we're going to take a closer look at why these stories are so important by taking a look at a couple of the website pages that visualize federal funding for city agencies. The agency pages don't necessarily support direct action, but they are intended to be repositories for each and every federal human services grant that supports the city's budget and yours. And they're organized by which city agency they support. And in those, you can sort of drill down into trends and current funding, even into the agency's program areas. And then the stories are what put these grants in context. So Gaurav's going to show you a quick example using the DIFTA repository.
Thanks, Derek. So I mentioned earlier that federal grants for social services have fallen by more than $300 million. Of that, DFTA's federal grants have fallen by $19 million, or 26% since 2010. One of the federal grants that are driving that decline is the Family Caregiver Support Grant, which you can learn about here by clicking on the glossary. Although the Family Caregiver Support Grant is a relatively small program, being nominally funded at $5 million in FY19, it's not only a program that member organizations such as Heights and Hills relies on, it's a program that saves lives. And it's the stories that member organizations such as yourselves provide to illustrate that essential point. If it were not for the stories, we wouldn't know how much impact this grant has. Therefore, to bring the data to life, we also feature stories on the federal funds tracker as told by our members of individuals whose lives were positively impacted by federal support. For example, and continuing our focus on Heights and Hills and the Caregiver Support Grant, we have the story about Karen. So Karen was feeling overwhelmed and isolated by her mother's advancing Alzheimer's disease. So, one day she was standing on the edge of the subway platform and contemplated jumping on to the tracks. However, she also knew that she had a call with her support group later that evening. So she shared her feelings with them, and she found the strength to continue to provide the support and care that her mother needed. That very support group was part of the Heights and Hills Caregiver Program, a program not only supported by the Caregiver Support Grant, but also provides support for 1,300 family caregivers in Brooklyn alone. Now I'll pass it back on to Derek.
Thank you, Gaurav. As Gaurav mentioned, it's a relatively small grant compared to the other grants, but again, these stories just show that even such a program can save lives. And as Gaurav mentioned, it's Heights and Hills has 1,400 folks signed up in that program alone. Now we'll, again, we're going to host an in-depth training next year, but creating a bridge to direct action and amplifying your stories isn't all our initiative offers. So Gaurav presented the data earlier on human services funding to New York City. Some of you might have wondered which grants comprise this funding. Well, we do have some new features on the new site that allows users to explore that data. And we want folks to stay tuned as we'll continue to update these. So here you can look at 2019 grants. We also added in COVID relief grants based on our latest analysis. And again, we'll continue to update these. So it's just there as a sort of an exploratory tool. And just because our focus is on one side of the ledger, that being the spending side of the federal budget, we'll also from time to time work on issues on the other side of the ledger, such as supporting tax policy that improves the lives of low-income communities, or opposing tax policies that only improve the lives of powerful individuals and profitable corporations, such as our rally on Wall Street that Gaurav's going to share a photo of, in which we were opposing the Trump tax cuts. Because of course that takes money away from the programs that we care about. Likewise, we've issued a few reports, collected signatures for letters, and hosted Zoom meetings with members of Congress to push for comprehensive relief from the COVID pandemic. And those resources can be found here on our COVID resource page. So lastly, before we conclude, we just want to show you that we also have some powerful policy analysis tools that our members can use to visualize their federal funding for those who have time to explore such tools. That includes a tree map of your grants from the latest audit year data, or analysis of how your federal revenue would fare under specific budget proposal. So this is, I believe, SEO family of services. You can see on the chart to the right the change from the House budget to the compared to the president's budget. And all one has to do to run these analyses is just choose your organization from the drop-down menu. And those are found on the open data page of our website. Data also exists for all federal funding, much of which also matters to the lives of New Yorkers, right? Such as education, transportation, and so on, that anyone can analyze. For example, much of the debate around police reform is rightly focused on local budgets, since that's where the bulk of funding comes from. But we, of course, were curious about federal funding. So we used the spreadsheet that is on the website, and we found that, as we talked about earlier, human services fell over the last decade. But during that time, funding for the NYPD increased. And this is largely driven by a counterterrorism grant, but there was a lot of concern from advocates, civil liberty organizations, humanitarian organizations, and religious institutions that described this grant as central to the acceleration of police militarization. We hope to continue using this data infrastructure to draw attention to other categories of federal spending. And anyone can. The value add here is that these data aren't available by the city in a spreadsheet. We spent some time sort of organizing, scraping, and analyzing these so folks can use. So that's a sort of a big picture preview of the website. Again, we're going to do a training next year. We just want to put one more plug in for the story collection. Some of you have probably received an email from us, and if not, we just like to connect with you. And if you're willing to share a story, perhaps you could put your email address in the chat box. Alex, would that be okay if folks put their email address in the chat box?
They can do that. Alternatively, too, we can put ours, and you can just reach out directly with us. Appreciating you may not want everyone to have your address, but certainly take our address and feel free to reach out to us, and we'll follow up as well after today, just to see too and learn more about what you thought of today's presentation. Also, just get a better sense too of how federal funds do in fact impact your organization, and how we can continue to be of support in both understanding those shifts and advocating for improvements.
Thanks, Alex. And I went ahead and put my email address in there so folks can shoot us an email directly. And what we hope to do with this is, one, they're going to live on the website, but we'd like to put a report together of sort of all the stories that we have and include that in some of our materials as we start to make connections with new members of Congress and introduce ourselves again in the 117th Congress. So again, please feel free to reach out with any questions apart from sharing stories, or with questions about the tracker. We can do individual trainings, or if you just have thoughts on what else could be helpful, and so on.